So Fire Emblem Warriors Three Houses is the newest addition in the long-running warrior game franchise, which is a giant epic kill a bunch of enemies, button mash to your heart content series where you can get Berserk, you can get Legend of Zelda. They take all different franchises and kind of turn them into a different style of game while still trying to stay true to the overall theme and gameplay that sometimes has come before. And I've never been a big fan of these games, mainly because they weren't for me, and they hadn't really been doing something that I needed to get my hands on. Like, as much as I thought the latest Zelda one was cool, it wasn't something I felt the need to play. But Fire Emblem Three Houses being one of my favorite games of all time, I've put hundreds of hours into it, replaying the arcs and just loving the characters and loving the strategy where you pause, you pick where your army's gonna go, and it's a slower burn combat style, and it made me raise an eyebrow when I heard about this game because I really thought it was just going to be, here's the characters I love from Three Houses, but go beat up a bunch of enemies. Instead, what I got is probably the best summed down to is, imagine if Fire Emblem was a button mashing game with a decent hint of strategy, but all the general downtime that you came to know and love from Fire Emblem Three Houses is there. And rather than it being, I guess, what some people might call the what-if scenario, that what if instead of in Three Houses, the main character that you play, Byleth, what if she wasn't the teacher, and then what if she was an antagonist, and then instead, what if your new character, Shez, wasn't a teacher but a student, and then it branches off into one of the three routes here. Instead of it really feeling like a what-if scenario, to me it almost functions as Three Houses did, where in Three Houses there was 4 routes. One of the routes breaks off into 2, whether if you side with the church or one of the other characters. It kind of feels to me, rather than it being like a what-if scenario, it's more so, what if there was 3 extra routes to Three Houses? And that's why, on one hand, it does feel like, had you played the Fire Emblem Three Houses game, you're probably going to have a better understanding of the character motivations and things like that. Not to say the story's weak in any way, but it almost just feels like, because you don't get the Academy stuff for all too long in this game, it almost immediately branches off into the time skip and everyone's doing their own thing, whether they're the Kingdom, the Alliance, or the Empire, right? So for me, I had a lot better of a time than I think maybe some people might if they've never experienced Three Houses. Not to say they do a bad job at characterization. In fact, characters like Hubert I felt like were way more human in this game rather than just being the edgelord like he was in Three Houses. And the fact that your main character, the one that you play as, Shez, has way more depth than Byleth ever had. I mean, this game gives them all a voice and it makes them a lot more interesting, but it just feels like this game to me, it's like the perfect epilogue for me, something where I still wanted more Three Houses, but I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted because the stories had such great endings, and the different paths that now the central branches could go down was just so remarkable to follow. As someone who loves the Black Eagles, this is the only route that I finished. These games are long, and if you take the time to do the simpler things, manage your resources, train, tea time, which is now horseback riding, there's a lot of time sinks to these games, but one, I am going to play every single route to completion. The thing that I think a lot of people come to these games for is the combat, because it's fun taking out thousands of enemies and doing millions of damage within a single combo, and it's like the perfect gameplay of strategy meets tactics, because the button mash inside of it, you could not remember a single combo in this game. The combos aren't complex. It's basically like, okay, are you going to hit X or Y or A? Those are pretty much the main moves, sometimes the right trigger. That's basically it. And it's like, oh, if you hit this button 3 times and then switch to the other, you'll get this combo. If you hit it 4 times before hitting it, you'll get this combo. And it's very easy to remember different characters. Like, I know if I do this one combo with Hubert, it'll be a fire attack, but if I go a little longer, it'll then become a tornado, right? There's these different maneuvers that make it fun. It really doesn't matter which one of the combos I use. Basically, the reason I memorized because visually I liked looking at certain ones over the other. Or in the case of some of the warrior classes, they were just a little more fun because anything with magic or a big visual effect were just more interesting than seeing my character slash around a few times. But the tactics does happen in this game because this game has a really good idea of how basically you'll have a map at the start of one of your battles. There's basically like 8 per chapter. You can do a couple and then go to the main chapter, but you're not going to have as many resources to persuade different allies to switch over. Mid-battle, tactics, mid-battle. So you want to do all of them because that's where most of the fun comes from anyway, and they're not overly difficult, especially if you level up and manage your weapons. But what it manages to do is that as you capture different strongholds, as you're making your way to the main objective, which is usually to defeat some person within this map or maybe do a secondary objective midway through. It does a great job to make you say, constantly pausing the menu and telling your troops where to go. And they have this really cool mechanic that I don't believe was ever in Warriors game up until this point. I think it's called Shadow Slide, up to like 3 or 4 times. I think it's 3 times per match. You're able to, if you've captured an enemy stronghold and it's now blue, and say one of your characters is all the way up to the right corner of the map, and now there's these new enemies that spawned at the left corner, you can take that character and shadow slide them, so teleport them to one of your strongholds up to 3 times in a single match. And it allows for these different tactical plays because you can kind of predict where things are going to happen. As you're kind of progressing through the map, you realize that something's going to pop up at that left corner. So you're going to naturally position your troops to capture things, but sometimes things will happen and you can't spare one of your troops to stay behind, and the only way to really do it quickly is to shadow slide. So there's these really cool ways to do it, and when you get to the final like big mission per chapter, I think there's 16-ish chapters per route. I think it does depend if you recruit a certain character midway through, if you get a couple extra. But the idea of the big battle is that instead of just having 4 troops, you'll have 8 troops, but you only control 4 per match. So your extra ones, what I typically would do was I would basically connect them with one of my controllable characters. So if I was playing with my central crew, which usually was Edelgard, the main character Shez, I loved Bernadetta, and I usually had Hubert as well. So what I would do is I'd have each of my extra characters connected so they would support them, and then need be, I could, in the middle, pause the menu, take them, drag them to a new objective, and it just allowed me to control the map in a very tactical way as I constantly, with a push of a button, am taking control of my different characters and just unleashing this combat of just magical fury. In fact, I go as far to say I probably had more fun playing this game than I did with Three Houses, and that's not a diss at Three Houses, and I think the reason I enjoyed it was 2 things. One, I love the characters already. I have this deep understanding with hundreds of hours of dialogue and combat and things like that, but having more arcs of like, what if the arcs went this way instead of this way, while also just having a lot more fun gameplay, because it's not like it's just mindless button mashing, there is this tactics to it. It just gave me this sense of closure that I'm so excited to see where Fire Emblem goes from here now, rather than saying, man, if only we could get one more game. But how would you give another game when all their arcs came to a pretty solid conclusion? Well, you do it like this. You introduce a new character that diverts the story in an interesting way, while not basically replacing the main character of the previous game. And it's interesting to see 2 different teams handle this cast of characters, but have it feel exactly like they should act and perform. And it was a really solid experience that really, I mean, the most fun in terms of Fire Emblem to me with Three Houses was the after the battle stuff, where you would micromanage everything. You would train, you would have support conversations. You'd have all these different things pop up that allowed you to connect to these characters and manage it in a tactical way. And then when it came to the action, I came to love the action in Three Houses, which usually that type of gameplay wasn't for me. But with something just feeling so action-oriented, but still giving that hint of strategy that's not overwhelming, it's not super complex, it's a little overwhelming when you jump into any of these games for the first time and you have to remember how to do things. But once you get past the prologue, you just naturally understand what to do. And even though, come chapter 12, I was discovering mechanics in the camp that I didn't realize I could do, it still didn't ruin the experience not knowing about them until later, right? Like the idea that the way you train your characters, right? If you have different characters training together as they're leveling up their stats, they will build their support conversations while doing that. Like, it's easy to overlook certain things, even though it tells you technically everything. When you have so many different things to do in the game, it's very easy to overlook the smallest things, which can actually aid in building that narrative further and further. I honestly think this game is an absolute must-buy for anyone who enjoys action games, but also story-driven games. Because what I was really pleasantly surprised by was it felt exactly like Three Houses when it came to how the characters talk, the way the characters interact, and the downtime between matches. And I think the fact that there is tactics involved, it's like the perfect blend of tactics meets button mashing. It kind of hits everything that I think a Fire Emblem Three Houses fan would want, and even newcomers who are new to this, you know, it's going to be a great gateway to them probably picking up Three Houses in the process, because it does a good job at telling the story. The biggest thing for me was it just immediately jumps into that time skip, more or less. And then in return, you lose a lot of the slower kind of school stuff, which actually built up the character interactions. So between Dimitri and Edelgard and everything like that, it just felt like there was a bit more connection before they split off and did their own things and then started to fight each other, right? But it's such a fantastic game, and I love talking about all these Nintendo first-party games and everything and the like. I may not talk about games all too much on the channel, but when I do talk about them, it's because they suck me in so well. And I'd love to know everyone's thoughts if you did end up picking it up, or have been watching people play it, or plan to pick it up. What did you think of Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes? And I mean, if you have any other Warrior games that you'd recommend me if I love this one, let me know down below, because honestly, I have heard, like, the handheld version of this, if you play it out of the dock, it does have frame rate issues. I played on my 4K TV, it looked beautiful, it never stuttered, it just ran really smooth. So these types of games are probably best played if you do play in docked mode on your TV. You're going to catch all the little details and also just have a way better performance time. But thoughts down below, leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you're new around here. Till next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.